Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of The Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast out. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Our first story is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey in 2017 and the 2 years it took to rebuild. Patron Driven is out now, wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so back to this podcast. We're going to be talking about a new book published by the University of Toronto Press. It's called Minds Alive, Libraries and Archives Now, and it features an amazing collection of essays from a wide range of international scholars. The volume sets out to challenge, in a constructive way, the current ideas around the value of libraries, archives, and those who work in them. In a fundamental way, it acknowledges that the world and the citizenry that inhabits it are rapidly changing and goes on to examine how the profession needs to change alongside. My guest is Dr. Tony Samek. Tony is professor and chair at the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alberta. Tony co-edited Minds Alive with Dr. Patricia Demers, who is Distinguished University Professor in the Department of English and Film Studies, also at the University of Alberta. This series is brought to you by the University of Toronto Press. In this final episode of our series, Tony explores the unique opportunities for libraries and their archives, institutional partnerships, and how we might view libraries and their roles in light of challenges that we're all going through now with COVID-19. Okay, so I did want to, and you've brought this up as well. There is sort of this interconnecting aspect between that the book addresses between libraries, museums, and archives. It kind of pulls in all 3 of those branches. And in Chapter 11, I think it is particularly good at this, and that's by Brendan Edwards, who is the head of library and archives at the Royal Ontario Museum. And it explores the unique relationship between museums and their libraries and archives. Dr. Edwards contends that even though museums and archives face the dual challenges of limited physical display space and the expectations that everything and anything can be digitized and displayed online, that there are actually opportunities to improve museum and library value through even more collaboration. So I'm wondering, if you can expand on that and talk a little bit about what Dr. Edwards is encouraging there.
Yeah, this again is a very important and interesting chapter. And when I read it, I actually think about a former student of mine, Stephen Carney, taught him many years ago, and he had a strong interest in the right to communication. And we just ripped off each other in an academic way many times. But he ended up working for where he is now, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, as a librarian within the museum. And so I've had many conversations with him over the years about, that kind of thing. And so thinking about, the librarian within the museum, or the librarian within the archives, or the archivist within the museum, and these kinds of cultural institutions and their connections. And, right now with the pandemic, as Pat would say, we're building, erecting barriers. Yes, they're plastic, as Pat would say. But Brendan's also advocating more permeable connections, as Pat and I were in touch the other day and thinking about this. And of course, for partnerships, we both were encouraged that he's basically encouraging all of us. Why not more back and forth realities such as visiting research librarian or archivist in resident, or a history or English department scholar in a residence in a public library. And we have to work around limited levels of exposure and understanding sometimes to these cultural institutions. I would say particularly libraries in the kindergarten to grade 12 challenge of certainly in Canada, where we've eroded the having a professional librarian, having legislation that requires us to have a library with the intention of the library. We've moved more to sort of digital common spaces, which is like taking out the book collections and putting in the computer collections. And it's
Yeah.
great to have volunteers and it's great to have techs, and these are wonderful people doing great work, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that we've got someone working with kids talking about expressive freedom and human rights and information and the 360 degrees on copyright and access and so forth. And we've got the budget imperatives and the technology challenges, the shrinking of the public sphere, attacks on evidence, attacks on expressive freedom. And so I think these kinds of challenges mean that if you're a kid in a K to 12 system that doesn't really have a school library and the space is being used for like publisher, scholastic, book fair, and technology, but you can go on have experiences then with museums and archives that
Yeah.
might round you out. So I think there's a sort of a there's a interesting modeling potential with what Brendan's putting forward around playing with information systems, but underneath there, I think there's also an urgency that we have to think about institutions that share space on the cultural and information network and make sure that they're working in solidarity, even though
Hmm.
the work that they do may be a little bit different. You have provenance in an archives, which is different than the way you organize a collection in a library. But at the same time, we work with records, and we are, in a sense, memory institutions. So I think that there's a lot of potential in what he's putting forth.
Right. So um, it's just sounding like there's a lot of opportunity for institutional partnerships, and not just in museums, but like particularly among libraries, faculty, and archivists, and um, there might be some very constructive relationships that we can be building there.
And certainly, Alice as an example and others in the book as digital humanities scholars. I think, that was one of the benefits as well of trying to reach broadly in terms of who could contribute is and having people rip off each other is that's where the creative energy does come, how we can work together.
Hmm. Um, so anchoring the book is a contribution from Dr. Frank Tuff. I hope I'm saying his last name correctly, but
Yes.
okay. So he's associate dean and professor of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and Dr. Tuff writes about the influence of this that about the influence the state has on archival information and materials, particularly about access to that information. And I'm curious why you chose this essay to close the book. Could it be that, as Dr. Tuff concludes, an overly optimistic attitude about attaining universal access and transparency does not match up with the realities of accessing government records in particular? And I'm particularly as he talks about for Aboriginal communities.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say when we all put in our contributor blurbs for the publication was quite some time ago, so he probably would want me to say he's no longer associate dean, but
Oh, okay.
he does continue as professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, which is incidentally, I think, just one of two such faculties in the world. So, and we're very pleased to have one in Canada. Well, coming, as we move through the book, coming up to Frank's closing chapter, there were a lot of implications for ethics and thinking about digital ethics and library ethics and intercultural information ethics and global digital citizenship and internet governance and internet inclusion. And we can also think about the sister field of journalism and media ethics and whistleblowing and responsible journalism and things we're hearing about a lot these days, biometrics. And we wanted to make sure, particularly launching the book from Canada, that we were tapping into something really important here and closing on that very powerful note. And we can talk a lot about equity, diversity, and inclusion and human rights and social responsibility, but we also never want to sweep issues for Indigenous communities under just a sort of diluted umbrella around social responsibility. And in the era in which the book was developed, so coming off the library, this Royal Society of Canada's consultation, the report came out in 2014. And then in 2015, Then we had the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada around needs for Indigenous concerns, and that came out with the TRC released its final report in 2015, and that kicked off a lot of energy within the field of librarianship, as an example, and the Canadian Federation for Library Associations developed its Truth and Reconciliation Committee recommendations. And we knew Frank here from our own campus, and we knew that he was an amazing advocate for library archives and museums as a scholar in the Faculty of Native Studies, and somebody that uses archives all the time, and
Mm.
somebody that has used his archival experience and work with records to be an expert witness in the courts. And so somebody who understands rights and information and law and Indigenous context. And we thought it would be a very important uh, way to bring the book to a close. And of course, it's a heavy chapter, it's a dense chapter. And
Yeah.
he highlights the need for reconsideration and amendment of basically the Freedom of Information Act
Mm.
in terms of urgent support and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And he really brings us into thinking about how the assertion of a right in this context almost always concerns an action of the state. And so, for members of Indigenous communities to litigate against the state to assert their rights, they are essentially dependent upon the evidence of and the access to records that are created by various government agencies, whether that's federal or provincial. And it's a very Kafkaesque chapter. It's fully
Yeah.
laden with issues and bureaucracy, and it shows the complexity of the context of information and law and community and human rights. And it just naturally came to be what we thought would be the most important closing chapter in light of what was happening in our home country and the sort of the 5 years coming up to when this project would come forth. And we're really, really happy with it. We're really happy that Frank stood by us. And as you can see, it's the kind of chapter you have to read once and twice and three times over to
Mm.
really get at it. But
Yeah.
it also brings us back nicely to the opening chapter with Alice, because there's that cautionary tale there. And as much as her chapter was humanizing, this speaks to the threats almost of what it is to dehumanize. So we thought it was
Mm.
really important, and we were very pleased with it.
Yeah, no, that really, really worked out well. And Dr. Tuff's chapter made me think about it, with the idea of access and transparency to information, sort of the political context of that, and especially here in the States where you have, um, you know, different, a new administration coming in every 4 or 8 years, and sort of with their own ideas of what quote unquote transparency and
Oh yeah.
access is, um, and how, access to certain kinds of information can suddenly go away depending on what their political point of view is. And so there's just no consistency there, I guess is my point. And that was kind of one of my takeaways from Dr. Tuff's chapter, that these things kind of change with whoever is in power, during
And
certain.
if that information is digital, government digital information, and it disappears,
Yeah.
it's if something's buried within an archives and there's legislation blocking who has access to it, over time we can sort that out. But
Hmm.
the digital tattoo being suppressed, repressed, disappearing is sometimes harder to get back. Although there are ways to do it, obviously, but yeah, it's very complicated. And it
Yeah.
happens all the time. I mean, I think when we had initial conversations about would we want to do this podcast? I had said that in my view, the most radical, urgent, critical librarians are the government librarians, and that is certainly the case in the American and Canadian context for sure.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so I can't really let you go without talking a little bit about how, we might view libraries and archives and their roles in light of the challenges we're all going through now related to, the pandemic. And so, just kind of generally, sort of looking ahead, what factors, whether it's access, transparency, accuracy, that kind of thing, are revealed during times like these, or what
Yeah.
have you been noticing, and what adjustments are being made out of necessity that could end up being permanent? What transformations or roadblocks that are highlighted in your own book are actually being proven out by what we're experiencing now?
On May, I think it was May 2nd, Saturday, May 2nd. Hopefully that's the right date. We had, with the school, we had a virtual closure for our graduating students. Normally we have an event in person that at least our on campus and some of our online students can attend. But of course, with the pandemic, that was all suspended. So we had a virtual little get together that one of our students, Luke Fagnan, organized, which was wonderful. And I said to the graduating students there, that they're right in the thick of it. And we're really, really proud with the choice they made for what they want to do with their life and labor. And of course, we're thinking about emergency and disaster planning, whether that's human made or natural disaster, and
Yeah.
records management and privacy, transparency, accountability, with all this tracking stuff going on, sharing and data mining and management and combating fake news and needing new information models and metrics. And we want to have a memory of this and this data, and we want to work from evidence, and we want truth around this. And all of this heightens the awareness and the importance of the kind of work that librarians, archivists, and museum and cultural network folks do. And of course, there's phenomenal activity at play in the public domain, recording locally, provincially, nationally, statewide, global responses, enlarged access to holdings, virtual book clubs, all kinds of things going on. And as with 9/11, such institutions are, in a sense, a refuge from the storm.
Yep.
They're a place to connect with family. They're a place to get urgent life and death needed information, a place to pray, and so forth. And the field is right in the thick of this complexity. And our students, as an example, chose labor that demands access to information, including government information, that they're focused on the right to know. They understand societal interest and the right to be forgotten. Is somebody's data tracking about whether they have the antibody positive or negative? I mean, what is that? Can that be forgotten later?
Yeah, right.
Work that is in service of lifelong learning, of course, and the work that's, as with journalists, work that supports fact finding and evidence-based decision making and informed citizenry, and work that supports just readings, of texts from multiple and diverse points of view, as we're hearing discourse in the U.S., for example, about, what are the implications of the pandemic for the African American community, work that promotes human rights, and work that works within the law framework, but does not stop from participating in law reform. And so all of the efforts are needed more than ever in the face of COVID-19 and sustainability of the planet and respect for all sentient beings and peace, not war. And of course, ultimately spiritual well-being. So we need our libraries, archives and museum workers more than ever. And, every time we see in the media the daily updates, it's like we need to save this information so we can understand it better later, because a lot of it is misinformation and disinformation, and some of it's, people would say propaganda, and some of it's truth, but somebody's got to sort that out, and we're not able to do it all on the same day.
Exactly. All right. Well, Toni, thank you so much for being on the program. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for your interest, Pat, and I and Leah and Mark at U of T are very grateful for your interest in the project. Thank you.
You just heard from Toni Samick, who co-edited Minds Alive, Libraries and Archives Now, along with Dr. Patricia Demers. Toni is professor and chair at the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alberta, and Patricia is a distinguished university professor in the Department of English and Film Studies, also at the University of Alberta. This series is brought to you by the University of Toronto Press. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.